Picture this. A blade is inches away from slicing an infant in half. The man holding the plough isn't a psychopath. He is a king. Odysseus drives the iron chair through the sand, screaming gibberish, eyes rolling back in his head. He yokes an ox and a donkey together, fighting their mismatched strength, forcing them to drag the plough while he sows salt into his own fields. He is desperate to prove he has lost his mind, but the soldier watching him, Palamedes, isn't buying it. Palamedes snatches the king's newborn son, Telemachus, from the nurse and throws the baby directly onto the furrow, right in the path of the oncoming blade. The test is brutal and simple. If Odysseus is truly mad, he will run the child over. If he is sane, he will stop. In a heartbeat, the madman swerves. He jerks the reins, saving the boy and exposing his own lie. The act is over. The soldiers grab him. The draft has officially begun. And the real Odysseus is dragged away from the only life he ever wanted to protect. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. That moment on the beach tells you everything you need to know. Forget the marble statues and the noble speeches. This is a story about a man who would ruin his own kingdom just to avoid a war. And he had good reason to be terrified. The year is roughly 1200 BC. The world is ending. Historians call it the Bronze Age collapse, but for the people living through it, it felt like the apocalypse. The great superpowers of Egypt, the Hittites, and Mycenae were crumbling. Cities were burning from Greece to Gaza. Mysterious raiders known as the Sea Peoples were scouring the coastlines, leaving nothing but ash in their wake. Trade routes were severed. Famine was rampant. In this chaotic landscape, Odysseus wasn't a refined monarch sitting on a velvet throne. Archaeology on the island of Ithaca reveals a different reality. He was a chieftain, a warlord living in a fortified stone outpost, commanding a fleet of fast, red-painted galleys. His power didn't come from divine right. It came from his ability to raid his neighbours and hold his ground. This distinction is crucial. When we call him a hero, we apply modern morals to a Bronze Age survivor. The ancient texts call him polytropos, which means the man of many turns. That isn't a compliment about his wit. It means he is slippery, dangerous, willing to do whatever is necessary to keep breathing. The Trojan War was not a glorious crusade for Helen's honour. It was a massive predatory raid, a coalition of desperate Mycenaean warlords banding together to sack a wealthy rival before their own societies collapsed at home. Odysseus knew that leaving his island undefended in such a violent era was a death sentence for his dynasty. He knew the wolves would come for his wife and son the moment his sails disappeared over the horizon. Palamedes may have won the game on the beach, forcing Odysseus onto the ship, but he made a fatal error. He created an enemy who plays by no rules. Odysseus stepped onto that boat not as a soldier seeking glory, but as a cornered animal. And as the fleet set sail for Troy, he began to sharpen the very specific set of skills that would eventually burn that city to the ground. To understand why that man on the beach was willing to slice his own son in half to save him, we have to look at his blood. Odysseus was not born into a lineage of shining knights or altruistic saints. He was bred from criminals. If we reconstruct the early timeline of Odysseus's life, we find a family tree that looks more like a police lineup than a royal registry. His maternal grandfather was a man named Autolycus. In the ancient texts, Autolycus isn't praised for his honour. He is feared as the king of thieves. He was a shapeshifter, a liar, and a manipulator who could steal a herd of cattle right out from under your nose and repaint them so you wouldn't recognise them in the morning. When the baby Odysseus was born, this grandfather was asked to name the child. Usually names were hopeful, like Strongarm or Godlover. Autolycus looked at the infant and gave a chilling response. He said that since he had been a source of pain to so many, let the child be named Odysseus. The name comes from the Greek verb odyssemenos. It doesn't mean brave. It roughly translates to the hated one, or more accurately, he who gives and receives pain. From day one, he was branded. He was not destined to be loved. He was destined to suffer and to cause suffering. This upbringing created a very different kind of leader. While other heroes like Achilles or Ajax were being trained in the art of bia, meaning raw physical force, Odysseus was mastering metis. This is a crucial Greek concept. Metis is cunning. It is the intelligence of the ambusher, the trap maker, the octopus that changes colour to hide from the shark. He learned early on that the world does not care about fairness. There is a famous story from his youth that serves as the first real scar on his psyche. While visiting his grandfather, the teenage Odysseus went on a boar hunt on Mount Parnassus. A wild boar is not a pig. It is 300 pounds of muscle and razor-sharp tusks. During the hunt, the beast charged. It gored Odysseus deep in the thigh, ripping through muscle and sinew. He killed the animal, but the wound nearly ended him. That scar on his leg never fully healed. It became his defining physical feature, a permanent reminder etched into his flesh that nature is violent, unpredictable, and faster than you. You cannot box with a wild boar, you cannot reason with it, you have to outsmart it, or you have to kill it before it sees you. So when we fast forward back to the Trojan War, we can see why Odysseus was such an anomaly among the Greeks. He was surrounded by men who treated war like a sport. They wanted to drive their chariots into the open field and duel for glory. Odysseus looked at the walls of Troy and saw a mathematical problem. He didn't care about glory. He cared about efficiency. He knew that a fair fight is a stupid fight. This philosophy terrified his enemies, but it also unsettled his allies. The Greeks needed his brain, but they despised his methods. He was the man you called when you needed a dirty job done in the dark. And the first person to learn this lesson the hard way was Palamedes, the clever soldier who had thrown baby Telemachus in front of the plough. Odysseus never forgave him. For years he waited, nursing that grudge, watching Palamedes rise in the ranks, and then he struck. Not with a sword, but with a lie. Odysseus forged a letter from the Trojan king Priam, planted gold in Palamedes' tent, and framed his own comrade for treason. The Greeks, easily manipulated, stoned Palamedes to death. Odysseus watched the execution of the man who had forced him into the war. He didn't lift a finger to save him. He had essentially murdered a fellow officer to settle a personal score. The transformation was complete. The son of pain had arrived at Troy, and he was just getting started. If you look at the timeline of the Trojan War, the fighting didn't last for a few weeks. It dragged on for 10 grinding years, and for 9 of those years, almost nothing happened. We need to shatter the Hollywood image of constant adrenaline-fueled duels. The reality of historical Troy was a decade of stalemate. It was a siege, not a sprint. For the Greeks beached on the coast, it meant dysentery, flies, rusted bronze, and boredom. They were stuck between the impenetrable walls of the city and the indifferent sea, watching their supplies rot and their morale evaporate. In this environment, the shiny, muscle-bound heroism of men like Achilles began to lose its value. Achilles was a blunt instrument. He was great for a terrifying charge across an open plain, but he was useless at solving the problem of the 50-foot stone wall. Then, the unthinkable happened. Achilles died. The seemingly invincible avatar of violence was brought down by an arrow to the heel. His death marked a massive psychological shift for the Greek army. The era of force was over. If they were going to take this city, they couldn't just punch their way in. They needed a new kind of weapon. This transition triggered a vicious internal conflict known as the contest for the arms. The question was simple: who deserves the magical armour of Achilles? The two candidates represented the two souls of Greece. On one side, you had Ajax the Greater. He was a human siege tower, the strongest man left alive, the cousin of Achilles. He represented the old way: honour, muscle, and standing your ground. On the other side stood Odysseus, the short, scarred tactician from a rocky backwater. In a traditional warrior culture, Ajax should have won by a landslide. He had carried Achilles' body off the battlefield while Odysseus held back the Trojans. But the Greeks didn't hold a wrestling match to decide the winner. They held a debate. This was the moment Odysseus proved that the tongue is sharper than the spear. He didn't talk about lifting heavy stones. He talked about strategy. He argued that while Ajax saved the body, he, Odysseus, was the one who secured the future of the war. He spun words into a web, painting Ajax as a mindless brute, and himself as the necessary architect of victory. The judges, fellow soldiers and generals, were swayed. They voted for the liar over the fighter. The aftermath was tragic and disgusting. Ajax, humiliated by the loss of honor, suffered a mental breakdown. In a fit of madness, some say sent by Athena, but perhaps just the breaking point of a decade of trauma, he slaughtered a herd of livestock thinking they were the Greek generals who had betrayed him. When he woke up and saw what he had done, bathed in the blood of sheep, not kings, he fell on his own sword. Odysseus had effectively killed the greatest remaining warrior of his own army without ever drawing a weapon. With Ajax dead and Achilles buried, Odysseus became the de facto leader of the Greek spirit. The war was no longer about honor. It was about winning at any cost. The inhibitions were gone. He began to deploy tactics that would be considered war crimes by modern standards. He captured a Trojan seer named Helenus and tortured him for information. He authorized night raids to slit the throats of sleeping allies of Troy. He was stripping away the rules of engagement layer by layer. The stalemate had to break. And since the walls of Troy wouldn't crack under force, Odysseus decided it was time to open them from the inside. He began sketching plans for a device, not a weapon of mass destruction, but a weapon of mass deception, a wooden statue that would exploit the Trojans' religious piety against them. The stage was set for the most famous special operations mission in history. The Trojan horse is perhaps the most famous military maneuver in history. But in the popular imagination, it's often treated like a harmless magic trick, a jack-in-the-box that popped open and won the war. The reality, as described in the darker corners of the epic cycle, was a masterpiece of psychological warfare and religious manipulation. Odysseus didn't just build a statue, he built a trap designed to exploit the Trojans' deepest fears. By inscribing it as an offering to Athena, he turned the Trojans' piety into their poison. If they destroyed it, they risked angering the goddess. If they brought it inside, they had to dismantle their own gates, the physical manifestation of their defense. The Trojans, exhausted by 10 years of siege and desperate for a sign of victory, took the bait. They dragged the belly of the beast into the heart of their city. They celebrated the end of the war with wine and dancing, unaware that they were partying on their own graves. When night fell, the heroism ended, and the butchery began. Odysseus and his select team of commandos didn't storm out to fight soldiers. They slipped out to open the gates for the rest of the Greek army that had silently returned under the cover of darkness. What followed was not a battle, it was a liquidation. The sack of Troy is the moment where the Greeks lost their souls. In the frenzy of victory, all discipline evaporated. The streets ran slippery with blood. Men were slaughtered in their beds. Women were dragged by their hair into slavery. But the true horror lay in the specific acts of sacrilege that would haunt the Greeks for the next decade. Neoptolemus, the teenage son of Achilles, found the elderly King Priam seeking sanctuary at the altar of Zeus. He didn't respect the holy ground. He butchered the old man right on the altar, spraying the statue of the god with the royal blood. Ajax the Lesser found the Princess Cassandra clinging to the statue of Athena for protection. He didn't care. He dragged her away and raped her inside the temple, toppling the goddess's image in the process. And then there was Odysseus. While he may not have been the one raping priestesses, he was the architect of the night's cruelest necessity. The Greeks debated what to do with Astyanax, the infant son of the fallen Trojan hero Hector. If the boy lived, he would grow up to avenge his father and rebuild Troy. The logical, cold-blooded decision was made. The baby was torn from his mother's arms and thrown from the high walls of the city. His skull was crushed on the rocks below. Some sources say it was Neoptolemus who threw him. Others point to Odysseus. But it doesn't matter who physically dropped the child. It was Odysseus's logic that justified it. It was Odysseus's plan that enabled it. As dawn broke over the smoking ruins of historical Troy, the Greeks stood victorious. They had won. They had gold, slaves, and glory. But they had also committed the ultimate hubris. They had violated every sacred law of gods and men. They had turned temples into slaughterhouses and murdered children. They thought the war was over. They were wrong. The gods, specifically Athena and Poseidon, who had previously supported them, looked down at the smoking ruins and the desecrated altars with cold fury. The Greeks prepared to sail home, expecting parades and feasts. Instead, the gods prepared a storm. The winds that rose up weren't just weather, they were divine retribution. The fleet would be scattered, ships would be smashed against the rocks. The short journey across the Aegean would turn into a 10-year nightmare. For Odysseus, the sin of victory was the beginning of his true punishment. He had used his mind to destroy a civilization. Now, the universe was going to break his mind in return. The man who refused to play by the rules was about to be cast into a world where the rules of physics, geography, and time no longer applied. The journey home begins, but the map has changed. We are leaving the realm of history and entering a landscape of psychological horror. The first stop for the fleet isn't a battlefield, but a drug den. They land on the coastline of the Lotus Eaters. In the myth, the scouts eat a mysterious flower and lose all desire to return home. They just want to stay and dream. If we view this through the lens of a Bronze Age collapse survivor, the metaphor is screaming at us. These men have just spent 10 years butchering people. They are traumatized. The lotus is likely an allegory for the opium poppy, which was widely cultivated in the ancient Mediterranean. Odysseus finds his men stoned, checked out, and happy for the first time in a decade. A compassionate leader might have let them rest, but Odysseus is not compassionate, he is driven. He drags them back to the ships, weeping, and ties them to the rowing benches. He forces them to sober up and face the misery of reality. He denies them the oblivion they crave, but the real test of his character waits on the next island, the land of the Cyclopes. Polyphemus is not just a monster in a rubber suit. He represents the antithesis of Greek civilization. He has no laws, no assemblies, no ships, and no agriculture. He is raw, unbridled nature. When Odysseus enters the Cyclops cave, he is essentially walking into the maw of the primitive world he thinks he has conquered. We know the story. The giant traps them. He smashes the heads of 2 sailors against the rocks like puppies and eats them raw. It is a scene of primal terror. Force is useless here. You cannot fight a giant. This is where Odysseus's métier shines. He offers the monster wine, a product of sophisticated civilization and agriculture, to dull his senses. Then comes the masterstroke. When the drunk giant asks his name, Odysseus replies, Autis, nobody. It is a pun of genius. When he blinds the giant with a burning olive stake and Polyphemus screams for help, the other Cyclopes ask, Who is hurting you? Polyphemus screams back, Nobody's hurting me. So, his neighbours go back to bed. Odysseus has weaponized language itself, but then he ruins it. They escape. They are on the ship. They are safe. The smart thing to do is to shut up and sail away. But Odysseus cannot do it. His ego is too big. He has defeated a monster, and he needs the credit. He needs the glory. He stands on the deck and screams back at the blinded giant. If anyone asks who blinded you, tell them it was Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, from Ithaca. It is the stupidest thing he has ever done. He gives the monster his address. Polyphemus realizes his enemy is a mortal man, not a spirit. He prays to his father, Poseidon, the god of the sea. He gives Poseidon the target's exact name. The curse is laid. A massive boulder, thrown by the blind giant, splashes just behind the ship. A warning shot from the gods. Odysseus survived the cave because he was nobody. He doomed his entire crew because he insisted on being somebody. This moment confirms that the greatest danger to the fleet isn't the monsters on the islands. It's the arrogance of the captain on the deck. If the Cyclops was a test of wits, the island of Yer is a test of will. Here lives Circe, a minor goddess with a terrifying power. She invites sailors in, feeds them a drugged mixture of cheese, barley and honey, and then, with a tap of her wand, strips them of their humanity. She turns them into pigs. It is easy to read this as a fairy tale, but strip away the magic and you see a harsh commentary on soldiering. These men, starved and traumatized, are offered free food and comfort. They gorge themselves, they lower their guard, they behave like animals so they become animals. They lose the discipline that makes them men. Odysseus alone resists, fortified by a mysterious herb called moly, perhaps a real antidote, perhaps a metaphor for mental fortitude. He confronts the witch. He draws his sword, a phallic assertion of dominance, and forces her to swear an oath not to harm him. But even he is not immune to the comfort she offers. He stays in her bed for a year. While his wife waits in Ithaca, Odysseus pauses his journey to play house with a goddess. It is his crew who eventually have to shame him into leaving. They have to remind the captain that he has a home, but Circe gives him a piece of advice that freezes his blood. To get home, he cannot sail east or west. He must sail down. He must perform a catabasis, a descent into the underworld, to consult the dead prophet Tiresias. This is the psychological pivot point of the entire epic. The hero must die, metaphorically, before he can be reborn. He sails to the edge of the world, to the sunless lands of the Cimmerians. He digs a trench and fills it with the blood of black rams, and they come. The spirits of the dead swarm up like moths to a flame, desperate to drink the blood that will give them a moment of speech. First he sees his own mother, Anticlea. This is a gut punch. When he left for Troy, she was alive. He tries to embrace her 3 times, and 3 times she slips through his arms like smoke. She tells him she didn't die of old age or disease. She died of grief. She died waiting for him. The guilt is crushing. Odysseus realizes that his glory at Troy has killed the person who loved him most. Then, the shade of Achilles approaches. The great warrior, the man who chose a short life for eternal fame, now rules as a prince of the dead. Odysseus tries to flatter him, praising his legendary status. Achilles cuts him off with a line that shatters the entire code of the heroic age. He says, "Do not speak to me soothingly about death, glorious Odysseus. I would rather be a paid servant in a poor man's house above ground than king of kings among all the dead." Let that sink in. The greatest hero of Greek mythology is telling you that it was all a waste. All the medals, all the songs, all the statues, they are worthless compared to a single breath of life. This is the moment Odysseus truly changes. He stops caring about being a hero. He stops caring about how history will remember him. He realizes that the only thing that matters is survival. The only thing that matters is getting back to the land of the living. Tiresias the prophet then delivers the final blow. He tells Odysseus that the journey ahead will cost him everything. He warns him about the cattle of the sun god. He warns him that even if he returns to Ithaca, his house will be filled with enemies. Odysseus climbs back onto his ship, but he is a haunted man. He has seen the end of the line. He knows now that death is not glorious. It is cold, empty, and final. And he will do absolutely anything, no matter how ruthless, to avoid joining those ghosts in the dark. Fresh from the horrors of the underworld, Odysseus is no longer exploring. He is fleeing. But the ocean has one final gauntlet to run him through. A series of tests designed to strip him of everything he has left. His crew, his ship, and his pride. First, the sirens. Forget the Victorian paintings of beautiful women on rocks. In the earliest Greek art, sirens were bird women, scavengers with the faces of maidens, and their weapon was not lust. It was knowledge. Listen to the lyrics Homer gives them. They sing, "We know all the pains that the Greeks and Trojans suffered on the wide plain of Troy. They are tempting Odysseus with the one thing he can't resist, his own story. They promise him total understanding of the past. For a man suffering from the trauma of war, the desire to wallow in that glory and pain is an addiction." Odysseus begs to be untied, screaming to join them. He wants to drown in his own legend. But the ropes hold. His crew, ears plugged with beeswax, rows on. They save him from his own ego, but they can't save him from the Strait of Messina. Here, Odysseus faces the ultimate leadership dilemma, the choice between Scylla and Charybdis. On one side, a whirlpool that will sink the entire ship, killing everyone. On the other, a 6-headed abomination living in a cliffside cave that will guaranteed snatch 6 men. It is a mathematical calculation. Total loss versus partial loss. The trolley problem of the Bronze Age. Odysseus makes the cold, rational choice. He steers toward the monster, but here is the kicker. He doesn't tell the crew. He puts on his armor, grabs 2 spears and stands on the prow, looking like a hero. But he knows he is just serving up bait. The moment hits like a thunderclap. Scylla strikes. 6 of his strongest men, the ones who had survived Troy, the Cyclops and the underworld, are hoisted into the air, screaming his name. Homer writes that this was the most pitiable thing Odysseus ever saw with his eyes. He watches them get eaten alive. their feet dangling from the monsters' mouths, while he sails the rest of the ship to safety. He saved the ship, but he broke the bond of trust. The men know. They know their captain views them as expendable assets. That broken trust leads to the final disaster on the island of the sun god. They are trapped by storms. They are starving. Odysseus goes inland to pray, or perhaps to hide from their accusing eyes, and falls asleep. While he sleeps, the starving men butcher the sacred cattle. It isn't an act of rebellion. It is an act of biological desperation. The gods do not forgive. When they launch the ship again, Zeus strikes it with a lightning bolt. The vessel explodes. The timbers shatter. Every single man, Eurylochus, Perimedes, Elpenor, drowns in the black water. All of them, except one. Odysseus clings to a piece of debris, drifting alone in the vast, indifferent ocean. The general is gone. The captain is gone. He washes up on the island of Ogygia, the home of the nymph Calypso. This is not a vacation. It is a 7-year sentence. Calypso loves him, yes, but she loves him like a pet. She offers him immortality and eternal youth if he stays. He refuses. Picture the scene. A man who has fought gods and monsters, now sitting on a rock staring at the horizon, weeping every single day for 7 years. He has no sword. He has no crew to command. He is stripped bare. The man of many ways has no way out. He realizes that immortality without home is just a shiny prison. He would rather die a mortal man in Ithaca than live forever as a boy toy in paradise. He's finally ready to go home, not as a conqueror, but as a beggar. When Odysseus finally steps onto the sand of Ithaca, the camera doesn't pull back for a glorious wide shot of a king returning to his throne. Instead, we find a confused old man waking up in the mist. He doesn't even recognize his own country. 20 years have reshaped the landscape, just as they have reshaped him. He is home, but he's not safe. In fact, he is in more danger here than he was in the Cyclops cave. The palace is occupied. 108 young aristocrats, the suitors, have taken over his great hall. These aren't just rude house guests. From a historical perspective, this is a slow-motion coup d'etat. They are eating his livestock, drinking his wine, and sleeping with his servants. They are dismantling his estate economically while waiting for his wife, Penelope, to pick a new husband. If Odysseus walks through the front door as the king, they will kill him before he reaches the hearth. It's 108 against 1. So the warlord does what he does best. He goes undercover. With the help of Athena, he transforms. The muscular hero with the sea salt tan vanishes. In his place stands a withered, filthy beggar in rags. This disguise is his masterstroke. In the ancient world, beggars were invisible. They were part of the scenery. By becoming nobody again, he gains the ultimate clearance to spy on his enemies. He doesn't go to the palace first. He goes to the pigsty. He seeks out Eumaeus, his swineherd. This is a deliberate narrative choice. The aristocrats have betrayed him, but the slave has remained loyal. It is in this smell of manure and straw that the most crucial reunion takes place. Telemachus walks in. The infant who was saved from the plough is now a 20-year-old man. He is angry, cynical, and dangerously impatient. He has grown up in a house filled with men who want to murder him. The moment Odysseus reveals himself to his son is not filled with hugging and rainbow-coloured tears. It is shock. Telemachus thinks he's looking at a god or a demon. He cannot believe this ragged stranger is the legendary father he has heard stories about. When the reality sinks in, the dynamic shifts instantly. They don't just bond as father and son, they bond as co-conspirators. Odysseus asks for the numbers. How many enemies? Telemachus tells him. Over 100. Any sane man would flee. Odysseus just nods. He isn't planning a battle. He's planning an extermination. He heads to the palace, still in rags. And here, the tragedy of the lost years hits him with the force of a physical blow. Lying on a pile of dung outside the gates is Argos, his hunting dog. Argos was a puppy when the fleet sailed. Now he is old, flea-ridden, and dying. But he knows. He smells the scent of his master through the grime and the years. The dog thumps his tail weakly. He tries to lift his head. Odysseus sees it. Tears well up in his eyes, but he chokes them back. He cannot react. If he shows emotion, he blows his cover. He has to walk past his dying best friend as if he were a stranger. As Odysseus enters the hall, Argos, having completed his watch, takes one last breath and dies. Inside the hall, the humiliation continues. The suitors mock the beggar. They throw a stool at him. They abuse him. Odysseus takes it all. He sits there, eating scraps, watching their faces, memorizing their positions and counting their weapons. He's suffering the ultimate indignity of a king treated like trash in his own home. But beneath the rags, the muscles are tensing. He's waiting for the signal. The return of the stranger is almost over. The slaughter in the hall is about to begin. The climax of the Odyssey is often framed as a battle. It isn't. A battle implies two sides fighting. What happens in the Great Hall of Ithaca is a liquidation. Penelope, possibly suspecting the beggar's identity or simply guided by Athena, announces a contest. She will marry whoever can string Odysseus's massive composite bow and shoot an arrow through the handle rings of 12 axes lined up in a row. This isn't a carnival game. A composite bow from the Bronze Age is a terrifying piece of military engineering. Made of wood, horn, and sinew, it requires not just strength, but specific technique to bend. One by one, the suitors fail. They grunt, they sweat, they grease the bow with tallow, but they can't even string it. They are soft men of leisure trying to handle a weapon of war. Then the beggar asks for a turn. The suitors laugh, but Telemachus orders the bow to be given to him. The room goes quiet. Odysseus handles the weapon like a musician handling a lyre. He inspects it for rot. Then, with a casual, fluid motion, he strings it. He plucks the string, and Homer writes that it sang like a swallow. That sound is the dinner bell for death. He knocks an arrow. He doesn't even stand up. From a sitting position, he fires. The arrow whistles through all 12 axes. The disguise is no longer needed. Odysseus rips off his rags. He stands in the doorway, blocking the only exit. He looks at Antinous, the ringleader of the suitors, who is leaning back to take a sip of wine. Odysseus aims for the throat. The arrow punches through Antinous' neck. He drops the cup. He kicks the table. Blood jets over the bread and roasted meat. The party is over. The other suitors jump up, looking for their weapons on the walls. They find nothing. Telemachus and Eumaeus have removed them all. They run to the doors. Locked. They are trapped in a stone box with the greatest killer of their generation. Odysseus announces himself. He tells them there will be no ransom, no negotiations, just death. What follows is a frenzy of violence. It is intimate and gruesome. Odysseus, Telemachus, and 2 loyal servants move through the panic-stricken crowd like wolves in a sheep pen. The floor becomes slick with gore. Skulls are cracked. Men are pinned to the walls with spears. Even the Leodes, a priest who begs for mercy, claiming he only poured the wine, is decapitated mid-sentence. Odysseus is not here to judge innocence. He is here to purge. But the most chilling moment comes after the silence returns. 12 of the household maids who had slept with the suitors and disrespected the queen are rounded up. Odysseus does not banish them. He orders them to clean up the mess. Imagine the horror. Forcing these women to scrub the blood and drag the corpses of their lovers out of the hall. When the work is done, Telemachus asks if they should be killed cleanly with swords. Odysseus says no, that is too honourable. They tie a ship's cable between a pillar and the rotunda. They string the women up by their necks, all 12 in a row. Homer uses a haunting image to describe their death. Their feet twitched for a little while, but not for long. This is the real Odysseus, not a shining knight, but a Bronze Age warlord who believes that order can only be restored through absolute terrifying extermination. The king is back, and his hands are stained red up to the elbows. Most versions of the story end there. The bad guys are dead, the king kisses the queen, and the credits roll. But history, and the darker corners of Greek mythology, tells us that happily ever after is a lie. You don't just butcher 108 members of the local nobility and go back to normal. The families of the dead suitors rose up. They demanded blood. Ithaca was on the brink of a civil war that would have wiped out Odysseus' entire clan. It took the literal intervention of the goddess Athena, a deus ex machina, to force a truce. But even with peace restored, Odysseus couldn't sit still. The man who had spent 10 years fighting the sea found that he could no longer live on land. The prophecy of Tiresias still hung over his head. He had to take an oar and walk inland until he found a people who didn't know what salt was. He had to appease Poseidon one last time. So the old warlord left again. He left Penelope. He left Telemachus. He walked into the wilderness, a ghost haunted by his own survival. Eventually he returned to Ithaca, an old man hoping to finally rest. But the past has a way of circling back. There is a lost epic called the Telegony. It describes the final days of our hero. It tells us that while Odysseus was with Circe, she bore him a son named Telegonus. This boy grew up without a father, hearing stories of the great king of Ithaca. Like Telemachus, he set out to find his dad. Telegonus arrived on the shores of Ithaca, but he didn't know where he was. Following the family tradition, he began to raid the coast for food. Odysseus, now old and grey, heard that a pirate was attacking his island. He didn't send an army. He grabbed his spear and went down to the beach himself. It was the instinct of the warlord. He had to protect his territory. On the sand, father and son met. They didn't recognize each other. They fought. Telegonus carried a unique spear, tipped not with bronze but with the poisonous spine of a stingray. In the skirmish, the boy thrust the spear into the old man's side. The venom of the sea entered Odysseus's blood. He fell. As he lay dying on the beach, perhaps the very same beach where he had once ploughed salt to save his first son, the truth came out. The return of the stranger had happened again, but this time the stranger was his own flesh and blood. Odysseus died in the arms of the son he never knew, killed by a weapon from the sea, just as the prophecy foretold. The death of Odysseus wasn't a tragedy, it was a consequence. He was a man who lived by the sword, by the raid, and by the lie. He survived the end of the world. He outsmarted gods, monsters, and men. But in the end, he couldn't outrun his own biology. So, who was the real Odysseus? He wasn't a saint. He was a war criminal, a pirate, a terrible father, and a ruthless politician. But he is also the most human character in all of mythology. He represents the terrifying resilience of the human spirit. He shows us that survival is messy, that getting home requires us to leave pieces of ourselves behind, and that sometimes the monsters we fight in the dark are just reflections of the men we have become. We look at him and we see ourselves, struggling against the storms of life, just trying to get back to where we belong, hoping that when we finally get there, we still recognize the person in the mirror. If you've stuck with me through this 10-year journey, thank you. If this deep dive into the brutal reality of the Bronze Age changed how you see the Odyssey, please subscribe and turn on notifications. I have a lot more forgotten history to uncover with you, and let me know in the comments. Do you think Odysseus was a hero or a villain who just happened to win? I'll see you in the next one.